It's time for another big old arcade history, and today it's the turn of Toaplan. The shooter guys, absolute experts in that genre in particular, responsible for several of the greatest and most influential blasters in arcade history, although there is actually a fair bit more here than just shooting. They were a great studio indeed, and a whole bunch of other great studios would spawn from them following their demise in 1994. But before that, we've got about a decade's worth of games from them, which we're going to go through chronologically. Much like the IRM vid, most of this is going to consist of us dining pretty damn well, especially if you like classic arcade shmup action. If you don't like the genre, if the word shmup brings you out in spots, well, don't sweat it. There are other games that Toaplan released that don't fall into the genre. I mean, not many, but there are damn good ones. So let's look at the complete arcade works from these legends going from 1983 to 1995. Happily, for a change, the release history of Toaplan's games is very well documented, meaning that for once it's easy for me to cover the games in true chronological order, rather than just doing them alphabetically by year. As far as the company itself goes, the origins of Toaplan are a little grey, but gaming-wise, the majority of the studio's staff started out at a somewhat lesser-known company called Orca. These guys only existed for a couple of years in the early 1980s, making around a dozen or so legit arcade games, as well as selling the odd hack here and there, including Crazy Con. As far as the folks who made Orca's games go, we only know bits and pieces, such as Kenichi Takano, soon to be in Toaplan and later the president and CEO of Cave, working on 1983's Espial, or Masahiro Yuge, later a part of Toaplan, working on games like Marine Boy and Looper. Although we can safely assume that soon-to-be Toaplan folk had input on the majority of their titles. Admittedly, they are generally pretty average and unmemorable, and Orca went out of business in 1983. According to composer Tatsuya Uemura in a 2012 STG Gameside interview, not long after he joined Orca, the company's name just disappeared one day from the elevator of the building that they were working in, although most of the employees continued to just come in and work on projects as if nothing had happened. They did this for a few months until eventually some Yakuza guys just showed up one day and told them to get the hell out of there. Anyway, that is how Toaplan formed. A bunch of young guys kept going back to the office of a dead company because, well, they didn't have anything better to do. They were a bunch of squatters, more or less. The Toaplan name was, in fact, originally taken from a company that formed in 1979 and started out renting PCBs to operators. It roughly translates to East Asia Plan. With this in mind, I suppose we can point to 1983's Vastar as, unofficially, the first Toaplan game. This Kenichi Takano title was the only game released by the zombie version of Orca, coming out after the initial bankruptcy and released under the branding of the Sesame Japan Corporation. You'll be shocked to know that this is the only game released by Sesame. Unsurprisingly, it's a shooter, and it's not a particularly bad one by 1983 standards. You play as a flying mech, and while you can't exactly power up a hell of a lot, you do have a shield that can protect you from the enemy's shots, although of course, it has a limited energy bar. You'll certainly need it though, as this game gets quite tough pretty quick. The graphics are probably the strongest thing here. You'll notice that there's a fair bit of parallax going on, and this game actually has a foreground parallax layer, which is kind of neat. Not sure if too many other titles before this one had that classic, intrusive foreground parallax. I mean, this is a couple of years before the Commodore Amiga was even a thing after all. A thoroughly unknown shoot 'em up, but it's decent. After the whole Orca setup went bust for good, another short-lived precursor was formed. This one was called Crux, and they were only credited on 2 titles. The first of these, from 1984, is both by far the better one and by far the more important one. This is Gyrodine, a helicopter-based vertical shoot-'em-up where you shoot targets on the air and on the ground. Kinda like Xevious, although your air-to-ground missiles do have a longer range than the more traditional bombs. What's also cool is that this game has more simulation-like chopper movement. You can't exactly strafe with the chopper, so instead you fire at an angle when you're moving left to right. A bit odd at first, but you quickly get used to it. This is a pretty fine shmup for 1984, and it's mainly important because this game does kind of kick off the relationship between Toaplan and Taito, who published this game. Now this may not be Toaplan quite yet, but it is where things start. It has a couple of home ports as well, including one to the Famicom. Definitely one that's worth playing. Things get a little confusing following the final breakup of Orca because, well, two companies actually formed in its wake, the first one being Ghox, and the second being Toaplan. It's not going to take long for Ghox to go bust, and I presume that a lot of their staff moved from there into Toaplan, which wouldn't have been too difficult as they were working in very close proximity to each other. Here we have the first game that's actually credited to Toaplan, and yes, it's Mahjong. This is Jong Oh, and it was published by SNK. We're only seeing this little flyer for the game because so far it's unemulated, but I thought it worth mentioning seeing as it's the company's first game. It was soon followed up by another Mahjong game called Jong Kyo. This one was published by an almost totally unknown company called Kiwako, who made a few Mahjong games and may possibly have a connection with Data East. In fact, according to a Tatsuya Uemura interview with Gammon Guy from 2009, Jong Oh and Jong Kyo are essentially the same game, and they're pirated from another company's Mahjong game, only with different pictures attached. We move into 1985, and Toaplan produces something a fair bit better than Mahjong for their next title. This is Performan, a top-down actioner that was published by Data East and designed by Kenichi Takano. Indeed, considering the rather sketchy history of the two Mahjong titles, this is really the first proper Toaplan game. I did cover this in the earlier Data East 80s arcade video, but I don't think I understood it at all then, and I get it a lot better now. This is a tough game in which you've got to destroy all the enemies, and you can also dig underground. However, they can too. You can take enemies out by either shooting them or by using the bombs that are dotted around the stage. Those can either be shot or you can dig under them to blow them up, Dig Dug style. It definitely takes a few goes at this to not just die immediately. The enemies are speedy from the off and they will pursue you from the get-go. But don't get too discouraged. You'll be able to hand with them after a bit and you may actually make it through a couple of stages. Once you get to that level, the game becomes a whole lot more fun, even if it is undoubtedly a tough cookie. Up next, here's Repulse. This was Crux's second and final released game, coming out in June of 1985, and this title was published by Sega. You may also know it as 99 The Last War. This is a fixed shooter where you're defending Earth against the almighty Aquila Empire, enemies come down at you, you've got a little bit of space that you can move in, and you do also have a limited shield for protection. Kind of like the earlier Vastar, only from a different over-the-shoulder perspective. Graphically it's not awful, but honestly the game feels past it for 1985. There's much more complex and rewarding shooters out there, there's barely any music, and this can't exactly hand with Golden Age legends like, say, Gyrodine. It's certainly nowhere near Performan either. Quite unmemorable, and honestly, it feels kind of unfinished. Most likely because Ghox had already bitten the dust by the time Sega got around to releasing it, going bust in the middle of the game's development. From now on then, we can just stick to Toaplan. It's here where guys like Tatsuya Uemura, who worked on this game, Masahiro Yuge, Osamu Ota, Yuichiro Nozawa and Toshiaki Ota join the company, and the core Toaplan team takes form. A group of young hotshots headed up by company CEO Yoshiyuki Kiyomoto, who had previously worked at Orca. So, for many people, this is probably where Toaplan really starts. The first game to be officially developed by Toaplan and published by Taito, 1985's Tiger-Heli. It also helps that the game was a hit, complete with some new innovations for the shmup genre. But while you certainly see the origins of this title in the likes of Gyrodine, Tiger-Heli really is the first game that feels like a proper Toaplan shooter. A lot of that is to do with what is often the most memorable part of their shoot-em-ups, which is as it should be because it's something they innovated. The Mega Bomb. Different in several ways to the Smart Bomb that was introduced in Defender, thanks to the big visual blast, and also the brief period of invincibility it offers you, making it a much more advanced defensive weapon, as well as being something that you're able to use a couple of times, while also picking up extra bombs as you go through the stage. As Tatsuya Uemura explains it, these bombs were initially put in as just a more aggressive weapon. It wasn't until people played the game that the devs realised that it was used as more of a defensive tool, a last resort against enemy firepower. Other cool things in Tiger-Heli include the appearance of smaller option choppers at your side to increase your firepower and provide a little shield of their own, and just a fine presentation in general. Gyrodine was really good, but Tiger-Heli takes everything up a level with the sound, graphics and whatnot. Damn fine game. Generally speaking, we're going to be seeing around 3 to 5 games from each year for Toaplan, and there is unquestionably one title in 1986 that is far, far bigger than the other two. This one here, Guardian, is not it. This is more of a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as a hero that is basically a Jimmy Hart version of tokusatsu legends like Ultraman or Kamen Rider or whoever. You go to various planets, punch and kick enemies, and ultimately face a boss. Apparently this game didn't do particularly well on the arcade floor, and if I'm honest, I don't care for it in the slightest. The hero is kind of useless unless he manages to get a blaster in his hand, and it's all just a bit too repetitive, with not a whole lot of difference in the stages aside from the background and the boss. Not a total stinker, but definitely one of Toaplan's lesser titles. Now, normally when I do these vids, I stick to the North American names for the arcade games. But, well, let's be honest. Alcon is a pretty rubbish name that doesn't mean anything, whereas Slap Fight is one of the best arcade names going. So obviously I'm going to go with that. This is another winner from Toaplan and Taito, a game that actually didn't do incredibly well, seeing as, according to a 1990 Gamest interview, there weren't actually a lot of Slap Fight boards made, but they all sold, and those who played it frickin' loved it. Slap Fight is a game that sees Toaplan get a bit more organised. We've got a core team of folks, and people don't necessarily just take on a single role and stick to that. For instance, here, Masahiro Yuge is credited as the game's composer. However, he was also a very key part of the game's design, and the same also applies to employees like Tatsuya Uemura or Naoki Ojiwara. Anyone can have input anywhere, essentially. Now, they aren't the most organised bunch, with this game being apparently the first where they produced any kind of design document, and even then they kinda produce them after the fact, just so they've got some documentation to show. Indeed, looking at interviews with folks like Yuge and Uemura, the general atmosphere at Toaplan's offices seems to have been pretty wild, almost like a constant party, with tales of skinny dipping, big old trips out, motorcycle accidents, and all sorts of other things that largely remain off the record. It is fair to say that they were young and wild, described by Uemura as more like a fan club than a company. Still, you can't argue with the end products. Now, the best way to describe Slap Fight is as a vertical take on Konami's Gradius, seeing as it uses a pretty similar power-up system. You grab stars, and you use them to power up the fighter. Initially, you will want to speed your ship up a bit, perhaps grab the side shots and the wins, and from there it's your choice as to what extra weapon you want, whether it's lasers, bombs, or the homing missiles. You can also get a shield to protect against one shot, which can be handy. Naturally, it's very important to survive. If you get blown up, you go all the way back to nothing, and much like Gradius, there's points where having nothing but the default loadout essentially makes the game unwinnable. Oh, and there are no continues in this arcade version, so good luck. Slapfight is certainly a tough as hell game and no mistake, for my money one of Toaplan's trickiest. But the action's good, the explosions are so crunchy, the music's a ridiculous earworm, there's a lot of hidden extras for players to discover, such as a Space Invaders ship. I can't think of too much wrong with this game at all. It's a fantastic shoot 'em up for 1986. Between this and Tiger-Heli, it is already pretty obvious where Toaplan's strengths lie. Yes, we have one more Mahjong game to quickly hit up. This one's Mahjong Sisters, and it does have a bit more of a rhythm edge, as apparently the lady on the screen will take items of their clothes off if you do well. You know, I wonder why no one thought to release an arcade version of the highly successful Samantha Fox's Strip Poker. That'd surely have been a smash, wouldn't it? Anywho, one notable thing about this game is that it's Toaplan's first self-published title, so it's a bit of landmark in that regard, although apparently it is still based on the rather dodgy code that powered the earlier Jong Oh and Jong Kyo. It would be 4 years before the studio self-published again, and it certainly wouldn't be Mahjong. We've got two absolute classic shooters in 1987, and here's the first of them, Flying Shark, which is also known as Sky Shark in North America. This time we're in command of a World War I style biplane, although that doesn't mean the firepower's decreased any, as you'll be laying down serious punishment on all sorts of enemies, even if they're much bigger than you. You've also got a bigger bomb too. Toaplan increased the defensive power of this signature item, giving players a longer invincibility period after using it. On a technical note, this was the first game by the company to use a Motorola 68000 processor, and their first game to use FM synthesis, which is certainly put to good use in the soundtrack. I like how the guy who interviews Tatsuya Uemura in 2012 for STG Gameside describes Toaplan's typical music style. He calls it headstrong gallantry, which frankly kicks so much arse as a term that I'm going to use it regularly in conversation from here on out. Just hope no one slaps me. Anywho, it certainly works well when describing Flying Shark's superb tunes. Everything about this game makes it yet another keeper, and there's a couple of excellent conversions too. I do have to make a little special note here for the venerable Spectrum version of Flying Shark, which was coded in a matter of weeks by Graft Gold's Dominic Robinson and ended up being a total winner. For those who have a distaste for the old micros, there's also a fine NES version too. It's awesome just about anywhere you play it, honestly. We take a little break from shoot 'em up action for the next title. Here we've got a platformer, and it's Wardner. You play as a hero named Pyros, and you've got a princess to rescue called Erica. Not exactly much of a plot, although, in fairness, it's considerably more of a plot than what you usually get in Toaplan's games. This is a game that often gets compared to Ghosts and Goblins thanks to its dark fantasy type setting and gameplay, although it's got some pretty neat stuff going on. Like a lot of Toaplan titles in general, the whole presentation is immediately likeable, and it's technically a very sound game indeed. Also, like a lot of Toaplan games, it's a pretty fearsome challenge. I don't know if I'm just terrible at the game, but I honestly struggle to make it through a few seconds in Wardner without dying in one of many different ways. If you're a fan of Ghosts and Goblins and you've not played this one, you probably should give it a go. It's absolutely fine. Twin Cobra puts you back in control of a helicopter, and the result is another smash. Indeed, this and Flying Shark were the most successful games that Toaplan made, for Taito or otherwise, and Twin Cobra became Japan's highest selling conversion kit of 1988. Again, there's a bit more evolution in the Toaplan style. Twin Cobra's got a big variation in the weapons, with 4 that you can pick up, and it often seems to players that there is a certain hierarchy to those weapons. The yellow one with the side shots, for example, is often seen as being a penalty weapon, sort of like how people see the torch in Ghosts and Goblins, although Yuge and Uemura have insisted that that's not the case, and that it is actually useful in some situations. You've got an even bigger bomb, even better music, and a nice pace. It's a purposefully slow game, one that Toaplan apparently wanted players to almost approach as if it were a puzzle. It certainly works great, and you can totally see why this was such a roaring success. Toaplan's shoot-em-ups just keep getting better and better, to be honest. There are some other quirky little facts about the game that can be found in interviews. The swirling pattern that the power-ups take was apparently inspired by donburi rice bowls, and according to Yuge, the original Japanese name for the game, Kikoku Tiger, was apparently a reference to the Japanese name of the Yes album Going for the One, which was called Kukoku or Ultimate over there. I'm going to have a soft spot for any game that manages to combine high-intensity shmup action with the very best of prog rock in such a manner, and it sure helps a lot that Twin Cobra is really, really freaking good. There's only 2 games in 1988, and the first one represents Toaplan's sole attempt at a racing game, the sole one that was released anyway. This is Rally Bike. You've got several stages, and while you don't have lives as such, you do need to get into a certain position in order to qualify for the next stage, kinda like Taito's own Continental Circus from the previous year. Fuel is, as always, a big deal. You will of course lose the game if you run out. However, fuel isn't just a gas canister that you pick up and magically get a full tank from. Instead, it's a station that you need to fill up at for a few seconds, meaning that a few riders will go past you. And so, you may not want to actually fill up every time you see the icon, depending on where you are in the stage and what position you're in. You've got turbo boosts, optional riders that can provide a bit of a shield, and there is a little bit more strategy here than you usually find in a simple top-down racer, which is quite neat. It appears as though this game actually did do quite well in Japan, even if it isn't exactly a memorable title from the studio nowadays, and it's not too bad, even if it is hardly one of Toaplan's best. The next game, however, well, this one definitely is one of Toaplan's best. In Japan, it's called Tatsujin, which translates to expert, and everywhere else, it's called Truxton. While Toaplan's last couple of shooters have had a more grounded military theme, Truxton plunges us straight back into sci-fi with a classic tale of Super Fighter meets Space Armada, and they both have a real good time. Put simply, this one is phenomenal. It's not actually my favourite Toaplan shoot-em-up, but it would absolutely be in the top 3, and I sure as hell wouldn't question anyone who said that it was their best. The general formula here is the same as you will find in Flying Shark or Twin Cobra, but there is one important addition: the almighty frickin' laser. Of the 3 weapons available to you, the homing laser is undoubtedly the most impressive one, the one that'll always stick out in the mind, and it is absolutely the one that lays total waste to anything it touches, especially when it's powered up and you're firing out multiple beams of murder. Apparently, according to Masahiro Yuge, this laser came to him in a dream, and he just knew that it had to be in the game as soon as he woke up. There are other cool intricacies here and there that, after appearing in Truxton, tend to appear in most other Toaplan shooters. One being that grounded enemies won't actually shoot at you once you get too close to them. Apparently this was done because Yuge, Uemura and company always wanted the player to know which shot had taken them down so that they could learn from it. They didn't want players to think that their games were unfair. Indeed, while Truxton may be brutally hard and easily the most challenging game Toaplan had released up to that point, it is certainly not unfair. The rules and the penalty for losing a ship are pretty damn clear from the off. As you play more, you learn more. And of course, if you're in a rut, you have the bomb to deploy, which in this instance is the absolutely incredible Skull Bomb, one of the greatest screen-filling blasts in arcade history. This, along with the rest of the game's art, was the work of Naoki Ojiwara. Yuge's music too, that absolutely wild soundtrack that just seems to always be going off on one, yeah, that certainly fits this action pretty well. It is funny really, as people in the West were a bit dismissive of this game when it first came out, and indeed for years afterwards, treating it as just another shoot 'em up. It is more in recent years, since the late noughties or so perhaps, where people outside of Japan have started to recognise Truxton more and more as an all-time great. The work of the legendary Mark Buslow of classic game room fame can't exactly be disregarded here. His evangelical worship of the game most certainly helped, and, well, it's exactly what the game deserves. One of the absolute best shoot 'em ups of its day. Up until now, Toaplan's shooters have exclusively been of the vertical variety, but this next game changes all that and sees the company dabble in the horizontal world. This is Hellfire, the first horror shoot 'em up that the studio made. Seeing as it's one of only two they did, both of which came out in 1989, you can kinda see that vertical shmups were always going to be their preference. Still, Hellfire comes with some rather different ideas. It isn't really like any other horizontal shoot 'em up that was popular at the time. The main gimmick of the game is that you can change the direction you fire in. You can shoot forwards, backwards, diagonally or vertically, and you're going to need to switch a lot from the get-go. It is a pretty neat thing, and it certainly makes the game challenging. It's another fine game in all the usual areas, although Yuge and Oemura weren't too hot on it in their GameSide Q&A. They felt that the making of Hellfire was a major struggle, and that the expertise Toaplan had in making vertical shoot 'em ups didn't exactly translate over to making horizontal ones, struggling in particular with the idea of having terrain that the ship could collide into. I think they did a damn good job personally, but I guess that is why Toaplan only ever made a couple of horror shoot 'em ups. They weren't as comfortable with them. Twin Hawk takes us back to the vertical shoot 'em up comfort zone, although I don't think this is one of Toaplan's better ones. It's just a little bit lacking when compared to the likes of Truxton or Fireshark. We've got the regular military setting, we're in charge of a plane, and the special gimmick here is that as well as the normal bomb, you can call up a squadron of planes that come and help you. They don't move, so they will eventually get blasted out of the sky, but that will definitely increase your firepower for a bit while acting as something of a shield. If you double tap the bomb button, then you get the more traditional big blast that we should all be pretty used to by this point. It's all perfectly okay, of course, all the Toaplan trademarks are present and correct, and it's certainly a good time, but it's just not usually a Toaplan shoot 'em up that I would reach for over other ones in their library. Something rather important changes with the next title we're covering. This is 1989's Demon's World, and it marks the first time that the Toaplan name is prominent on their arcade game, as opposed to Taito. After the success of Truxton, it became clear that the Game Center denizens were very hungry for Toaplan's style of shooting game in particular. Indeed, Taito would attempt to emulate that style themselves without Toaplan, with games like Fighting Hawk and Ashura Blaster, but they weren't as successful as the real deal. Toaplan worked out a new deal with Taito, and later with other companies, that saw their name take prominence. After all, it's become a mark of quality in the genre, a selling point in itself. Funnily enough, the first Toaplan and Taito game from this new arrangement isn't a classic shoot 'em up, but it is a decent side-scroller. We've got a rather cutesy horror theme, and a heroic ghost hunter, glasses and all, who blasts the spectres and double jumps all over the place. I always think of this game as being a little similar to Data East's almighty Chelnov, which came out in the previous year. It's very nicely done, filled with scary monsters and super creeps from Japanese folklore and beyond, and it's definitely one of the best of Toaplan's non-shoot-em-up titles. Although I suppose technically it is a run and gun, so it's not as if it's too far removed from the norm. The second and final horizontal Toaplan shoot-em-up is, of course, Zero Ring. Things change a little on the publishing front for this game. Zero Ring was actually published by Namco in Japan as opposed to Taito, and it was published by Williams in the States. You've got the regular cycle of weapons, the shot, laser and homing missile, but the almighty Zig also has a tractor beam weapon that can be used to trap ships. This is rather neat. Smaller ships can obviously act as a bit of a shield, and if you're able to snare a bigger ship, then that can be used as a bomb. Although of course carrying a bigger ship does have a bit of an effect on the Zig's movement. More regular bombs can also be picked up during the course of play, and you use the tractor beam on those as well. Grab them, then release it at whoever you want to blow up. I have a huge soft spot for this game, although again, the staff weren't too hot on it. In fact, initially Zero Ring wasn't meant to be released at all, and instead it was used as a training project for new members of staff to get used to the Toaplan style. Somewhere along the way, the decision was made for it to be a commercial product, and because you'd had so many people working on it, Yuge and Oemura felt that the end product was a bit cobbled together, with no consistent stage design or art style. That said, I still think it's fantastic. Although again, that is mainly to do with the Mega Drive version, which was the first Toaplan title I played. The Mega Drive version is, of course, the one that comes with the legendary introduction, all your base and so on, the story of a villain named Katz who gives you no chance to survive, make your time, and then you move the Zig for great justice and all that. It was around 1999 when this intro became a meme thanks to the dreadful English translation, and alas, there's no introduction at all in the arcade version. The intro just adds to the charm, really. Also, for my money, Zero Ring has the best music of any Toaplan game. The soundtrack is frickin' phenomenal, and it's certainly my favourite. Of Toaplan's two horizontal shooters, I'd definitely pick this one over Hellfire. Ah, yes. Well folks, here it is. My absolute favourite Toaplan shoot 'em up. The one that I would take to the desert island. It's Fire Shark. Now, I should say off the bat that this honour is largely reserved for the Mega Drive version of the game. That's the one I've played the most, and it is undoubtedly my favourite shoot 'em up on the whole system. Indeed, there's quite a few of these Toaplan games where I am more familiar with the Mega Drive ports than I am the arcade, which is no bad thing because the MD ports are uniformly excellent, and the original arcade title is obviously still a banger. Anywho, this is the direct sequel to Flying Shark, featuring the same almighty biplane, and it has the rather cool original Japanese title of Same Same Same. This sort of translates to Shark 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 in kind of punny fashion, playing off the original's title of Hishuzame and making it pretty clear that it's a sequel. There's so many cool little things here. Again, following the warm reception that the homing laser got in Truxton, Fire Shark features a similar and even more awesome looking weapon known as the Flamethrower. Again, once fully powered, this absolutely ruins everything on the screen. Indeed, all the weapons have their uses, especially when they're max power, and obviously you do not want to lose them. There's other little differences. Depending on the version you play, Fire Shark doesn't actually have the usual checkpoint system that you find in other Toaplan titles, opting for a quicker respawn unless you actively change it in the settings, and there is a setting that you can change where if you've got bombs in stock when you get hit, they will actually trigger automatically. With this, they are much more useful as a shield, although this isn't really a mechanic that Toaplan stuck with. Also, there are two versions of the game. The 1-player and 2-player sets are pretty different, with the latter jumping up hugely in difficulty, and according to the STG Gameside Q&A with Uemura and Yuge, they weren't too happy with the 2-player set. They kind of rushed it out a little, just in order to make some money. When you play the Mega Drive version of Fireshark, you do get the sense that it is more of the definitive version. The difficulty is fixed, the classic checkpoints are back, and the bombs no longer auto-trigger. And all the great things are present and correct. Another kick-ass soundtrack, lovely looks, the often rather amusing scenes that play out whenever you take off from another runway. This is one of my favourite shoot-em-ups ever, without a shadow of a doubt. The arcade version is pretty great as well, especially when you're playing the single-player set. While I do think you should actually play the Mega Drive version first if you've never touched this one, you should really just go ahead and play them both. As a side note, the Toaplan Mega Drive ports tend to end up so freaking good because, well, they were developed in-house, and they basically just did the simple thing, especially seeing as there were a lot of similarities between the arcade hardware Toaplan were using and the Mega Drive, same 68,000 processor and all that. So, move things a little so it looks good on the horizontal display, and there you go. No need to screw around too much, and according to Tatsuya Uemura, they basically just knocked out the Mega Drive ports in their spare time. Anywho, Fireshark. Again, one of the best ever. Toaplan rins in the new decade with a game that, well, shockingly, isn't actually a blaster at all. Instead it's Snow Brothers, a cutesy single screen game that's more in the vein of Bubble Bobble. It's worth noting that Toaplan are now starting to publish more games themselves. While Vastar published this in the States, Toaplan published it in Japan and Europe. This is a really nice single-screen platformer. Our heroes, Nick and Tom, can use the snow to cover up enemies and turn them into a ball, which they can either throw or roll, ideally taking out other enemies on the screen. It wouldn't be a Toaplan game without some power-up action, and so you are able to improve your speed, or make those snowballs a bit more powerful or what have you, and naturally you'll also have to take on the odd boss. This is very charming indeed, and a definite success for Toaplan. Generally popular in the arcades to the point where it received a sequel that we'll be seeing later, it won an award from Gamist magazine, and it got a fair few ports to the NES, Mega Drive and the like. Indeed, it could have had quite a lot more, although Ocean ended up cancelling the various microcomputer conversions of the game that they were working on. There are only 2 Toaplan games from 1990, and this next title is definitely the least famous of the pair, but it's still very decent. Outzone is full of shooting action, of course, but this is the studio's first top-down run-and-gunner, and once again they're working with a different studio. The game was published by Tecmo in Japan and Romstar in the States. The gimmick of this futuristic title is that you've got 2 weapons, and you switch between them by picking up the change icons. One of the weapons lets you fire in all directions, while the other one lets you strafe. In Tatsuya Uemura's interview for the Pixelated Audio podcast, he said that this mechanic gave the game a strong puzzling element that you don't usually find in games like this, although once again it proved to be a tricky game to develop. In fact, Uemura said that Outzone was the hardest product that he worked on, one where the creation of the game took so much of the time that he didn't really have a whole lot of time to concentrate on music until the end. Other than Uemura, Naoki Ojiwara was the main man heading up the project, and the name of the game's planet, Owajira, is a simple little anagram. Anywho, Outzone is pretty fun. The switching between fixed and free shooting can be a bit tricky to get used to, although it's usually simple to figure out what one's best for any particular moment. While run-and-gunners were again something a bit different and tricky for Toaplan, it's another genre that they would end up coming back to in a couple of years' time. 1991 is a bit of an odd year for Toaplan. We've got 4 games from it, but only one of them is a traditional shoot-'em-up, and to be honest, the shmup is a pretty long way away from their best work. This is kind of a year of experimentation, one where Toaplan go even further out of their comfort zone, and we kick things off with, a game I'm just going to have to call Teki for accidental slur-based reasons. This is Toaplan putting out a full-on puzzle game, one where you have to connect 5 blocks of the same colour either horizontally, vertically or diagonally. You can separate the blocks that fall in order to help with that, and ideally you've got to create chains and so on. It's kind of funny really. Teki comes out in the same year that fellow big shooter heads Compile released their first Puyo Puyo game, but while that became a huge success and started a series that's still going now, long after Compile's demise, Teki was not a hit at all, and is probably one of Toaplan's most obscure games. Honestly, it's pretty okay, but I don't think it's a hugely special entry into the big world of falling blocks. It was apparently quite popular with the Toaplan guys themselves, according to Yuyurumu in 2012. Someone was seemingly always spending time on the Teki machine in Toaplan's offices, even well after the game's release, and he says that it's too bad they weren't collecting any 100 yen coins from it. A sequel to Teki was apparently in development at one stage, but very little info about it exists. According to Junya Inoue, it was being worked on when Toaplan bit the dust in 1994, and it didn't make it out the door. Toaplan's sole shooter for 1991 is Vimana, a game that was published by Tecmo and, strangely enough, doesn't seem to have had an official arcade release in the States, only coming out in Japan and Europe. Of all the shoot-'em-ups that Toaplan released, I would imagine that Vimana is the least known of them all, the one that only 5% of people would get on a Sporkle quiz. And honestly, it's kind of an average title. It's pretty much just the usual space shooter shenanigans, really. There's a slight bit of Hindu aesthetic going on. The game is named after mythical flying castles that can be found in epic texts like the Ramayana, but generally there's not even a whole lot in the graphics department to get excited about this time around. The main gimmick is that the bomb is a circle bomb, where you spawn powerful balls of energy that rotate around you. These act as a shield, and you can also tap the bomb button to send them homing towards enemies. And well, that's it to be honest. Not much makes this game stand out, and apparently the game flopped. So, what happened? Is the goose cooked? Are bad actors attempting to destabilise Toaplan's position at the top of the shoot-'em-up world? Perhaps not quite yet. Ghox is a block breaker, although one with plenty enough twists and turns to make it more than just the usual bog-standard rip-off of Arkanoid. The stages are cool, there's good music, and Toaplan do bring a few of their little touches to the genre. There's a special button you can hit to spew out loads of balls everywhere, lots of enemies kicking around, boss battles. It's all quite neat. It could possibly have been a scrolling game too, which would have put it even closer to the shoot-'em-up world, although according to designer Junya Inoue in a 2002 interview with Continue magazine, hardware limitations stopped that from happening. Pretty cool spot of bat and ball action, all told. Certainly a more interesting and better game than Vimana. Our next game is also a bit of a spin on a classic. Here's Pipi and Bibi's, also known as Whoppee! What we have here is a take on elevator action where you've got to go to the computers and plant the bombs using stairs and elevators to get to your targets. There are 3 standout gimmicks here. The first is that once you've planted the last bomb, you have 20 seconds in which to get the hell out of the room, and if you either run out of time or lose a life during the escape, you have to play the stage over again. The second is the weapon you've got, a laser beam that can either stun enemies or knock them down a floor if you hold it on them long enough. The third gimmick? Well, that would be tits. With every stage of a building you complete, a bit more of a picture of the lady is revealed, and once you clear the 4th stage, well, Cue Fred Elliott. Now, is this strictly necessary? Well, not really, although I guess Toaplan hoped that the old knockers would shift a few more units. I don't know how much it really helped, although Pipi and Bibi's is certainly one of the better adult games that you'd find in an arcade. It's not a classic or anything, but it sure as hell beats playing yet another bloody kicks by way of Gauss Panic ripoff. (1992) sees Toaplan return to shoot-em-ups with a vengeance. Forget about puzzle games or all that other crap, we're going to go right back to blasting, and the results are going to be excellent. Indeed, we start 1992 with a direct sequel to one of the studio's most successful titles, that being Truxton, of course. Truxton II, or Jong Oh, doesn't change too much about the original's formula. You've still got a hyper fighter going up against the Gyrodine armada, you've still got red, blue and green weapons including the almighty homing laser, you've still got the almighty skull bomb. It is still the same frenetic and highly challenging shoot-em-up action, only with better graphics and sound. It's not exactly as groundbreaking as some of the other shoot-em-ups that Toaplan produced in their last couple of years, but it certainly fills a hole when it comes to the late 80s classic style of shoot-em-up that made Toaplan famous. Indeed, it is perhaps the last sort of game that Toaplan made in this vein. The final shmups that we're going to see from Toaplan tend to be a lot more modern and creative with their mechanics, and it's there where, even in their final months, Toaplan are going to set the blueprint for the shoot-em-up genre going forward. For now, Truxton II functions pretty well as a bit of a love letter to the studio's most successful titles. FixEight is Toaplan's second run-and-gun title, and it certainly ups the stakes a fair bit from Outzone, while also being similar in a lot of ways. As the title suggests, you've got 8 gun-toting mercenaries to pick from, all of whom have their own weapons and may bear a few similarities to famous celebrities. Once again, they've got 2 weapons that you switch between by stepping on change panels, and this time they've also got a special weapon that they can pick up. The original Outzone was a fine game indeed, but FixEight is unquestionably better. It's a title that's really had a big boost in reputation in recent years, simply because more people have been made aware of its existence. After Masahiro Yuge founded Tatsujin in 2017 to handle the old Toaplan IPs, and with the release of various collections of Toaplan arcade games, the most recent one landing on the Switch mere days ago, games like FixEight and the next game we're covering, Dogyuun, have really benefited from the arrival of these compilations. They did get good reviews at the time, but they perhaps got lost in the arcade shuffle back in 1992, when shoot-em-ups and run-and-gunners weren't necessarily the most popular genres out there. And when Toaplan went bust in 1994, it didn't take long for some of these great late-period titles to be forgotten. Thankfully, that's not necessarily the case nowadays. These titles are widely available, and they're absolutely hot as hell. Go and frickin' play them already. By this point in Toaplan's life, we've got quite a few new hires working on games, including the likes of artist Junior Inoue, programmer Tsuneki Ikeda, Satoshi Koyama and plenty more. And as these guys become more involved, well, Toaplan's games have become pretty fresh once again. Dogyuun, hailing from November of '92, was built out of the ashes of a cancelled mecha game, and it's a doozy. It's space action again, but the graphics have certainly taken a bit of a step up, with Toaplan right back to their best in the audio and visual department compared to the previous year's Vimana. I think of this one as a beam 'em up. Basically, all of the weapons are lasers of some description, which I'm certainly not going to complain about, seeing as they're all so pretty and so devastating. There are a few other interesting mechanics going on. You have the ability to combine your options with the ship if you want, which increases your firepower massively while making you a much bigger target, and there's also a tractor beam type weapon that can be used to capture enemies, a la Zero Ring. I think that Dogyuun for a long time was a Toaplan shooter that perhaps fell a little under the radar. It's a late period game and, like FixEight, it didn't get any ports out of the arcade, and it isn't part of a famous series or anything like that. In recent years, however, the game's reputation has improved a hell of a lot as people have become more aware of its existence. An absolute must-play, especially if you're a fan of lasers in shoot-em-ups. And so, we enter Toaplan's final full year. 1993 will see more fine games arriving, but financially the studio were starting to struggle, and that kind of shows a bit in their attempts to break out of the shoot-em-up genre that wasn't exactly the hottest thing going in the arcades when compared to fighting games and beat-em-ups. Grindstormer, or V5, is definitely a bit better known than the previous two titles. This did get a port outside of the arcades to the Mega Drive, and it is regarded as an important step in the creation of the bullet hell subgenre. While another game later this year is even more important, a lot of bullet hell mechanics made their debut in Grindstormer, including giving the player's ship a much smaller hitbox than normal, your shot changing somewhat depending on how you press the button, and no miss bonuses if you complete a stage without losing a life. Also, a veteran name headed up this project in the shape of Kenichi Takano, someone who'd been a part of the team since the Orca days, and after Toaplan's demise he'd be one of Cave's co-founders alongside Tsuneki Aikida, who also worked on this game. With all this in mind then, Grindstormer is pretty freaking important. Interestingly, the two versions of this game are very different. The Western Grindstormer has a power-up system that's pretty similar to the majority of Toaplan shoot-em-ups we've seen, in that you simply pick up the items for bigger weapons and then pick up power-up icons to power them up. Whereas the Japanese V5 has a system that's more like Slap Fight. You pick up icons and then use them whenever you want. V5 is often thought to be a spiritual successor of Slap Fight as a result of this, and I would definitely recommend playing the Japanese version over the Western one. It just feels a lot better. Either way though, it's an excellent shmup. You can also definitely see the influence this would have on bullet hell games, with the increased amount of bullets you're up against and the patterns that they take, and it's got plenty going for it in the usual departments that you expect Toaplan to excel in. Really freaking good stuff. Once again, Toaplan leave the shoot-em-up realm for their next title, and it's one that's kind of amusing, even if it is very far from their best. Knuckle Bash is a beat-em-up that was initially supposed to be a Street Fighter II style fighting game, but plans changed over the course of development. Mainly though, the reason why Toaplan tried their hand at this genre was in the hope that it would make a bit more cash due to its popularity at the time, and Knuckle Bash is hardly a standout effort in the genre. Mind you, it does have an awesome premise. You play as one of 3 professional wrestlers, and you're fighting in order to save the world of wrestling from becoming corrupted. The characters themselves are certainly very cool, my favourite's obviously the guy who's essentially a takeoff of Elvis Presley, and there's plenty of fun opponents. Interestingly, it's more of an arena-based beat-em-up than the norm, almost like an updated version of Renegade. You fight against mobs and bosses in a single area, then move on to somewhere entirely different for the next battle, as opposed to it being the usual belt scroller. I suppose this comes from the game originally being a one-on-one fighter, as opposed to a beat-em-up. Anyway, the ridiculous premise does make the game cheesy fun, but it is a pretty average title, and it didn't exactly set the arcades on fire. Here's something a little bit different. Sorcer Striker isn't a game that Toaplan made, but it is one that they consulted on and provided hardware for, and it's definitely worth including. This is the first game by an outfit called Raizing that consisted of ex-Compile and Naxat employees that had largely worked on the Unreleased games, and Sorcer Striker has a fair bit in common with the likes of the aforementioned Unreleased, and also Spriggan. In fact, gameplay-wise, it's probably most like Musha, the almighty 1990 Mega Drive shoot-em-up that was actually published by Toaplan in Japan, while the sci-fi fantasy theme is a lot more like Spriggan. Toaplan's input came both in consultancy, with Tatsuya Uemura advising Raizing to change the initial Chinese martial arts theme the game had in order to make something that would have broader appeal, and in providing hardware in the shape of the Toaplan version 2 board that the company had introduced in 1991. Raizing would continue to use this PCB long after Toaplan's demise, and it powered the likes of Armed Police Batrider and Battle Gariga. Anywho, Sorcer Striker is a fantastic debut. If you like compile shooters, you're gonna love this one, as it's got pretty similar systems, a whole lot of boss fights, and absolutely stunning graphics. Seriously, it's such a good looker that it even puts a lot of Toaplan's shooters to shame in that department. Raizing would end up making better and more famous shoot-em-ups than Sorcer Striker, but it's a damn fine way for these guys to introduce themselves, and I highly recommend it. Okay, the next game is very strange indeed. It's not even really something I can play, to be honest, as it doesn't exactly translate well to MAME, and not just because it's in Japanese. Enma Daio is more of an attraction than an arcade. It's a combination quiz and lie detector that naturally only came out in Japan, and it has a heavy yokai theme. The title translates to Kin of Hell. Honestly, while this can be booted up, there's not exactly any way to really play this outside of the original arcade cap, as you really need the polygraph. However, Yuya Uemura says in a 2009 Gammon Guy interview that the game actually cost a lot of money, much more than any other Toaplan title, and that it failed. With the company's business getting a bit more precarious, a failure like this one was something the company could ill afford.
Yes.
Despite the big flop that was Enma Daio, we still have a couple of games to look at before the end of Toaplan. Indeed, this next one is the final title to be released under the Toaplan name, and it is a hugely important affair. Batsugun. The majority of people who worked on Batsugun would go on to form the companies that rose after Toaplan finished, and it's often considered to be the first proper game in the bullet hell genre. The high level of action, the amount of bullets, the smaller hitbox, the general feel of the gameplay. It's all a lot like what you're going to find in games by the likes of Cave. The other big thing about the game is that you gain experience points for your weapons, and that rather than switching between weapons during the game by picking them up, instead you choose your preferred weapon at the beginning through picking one of 3 types of ship. Again, this is much more the sort of thing you would find in a bullet hell game, as opposed to a regular shoot 'em up. The result is freaking incredible. This is absolutely the best shoot 'em up that Toaplan have released for years, perhaps since Fireshark, and as such it's kind of a shame that this is the one where they bow out of the genre. You wonder what else could have come out under the Toaplan name. Still, this is one hell of a swan song. It may well be the finish for Toaplan, but it's a new beginning in the world of shoot 'em ups. Having said all that, it's not the right move to downplay the success and influence that Grindstormer also had. There's certainly a few things that game did first, and the games do share a few members of staff. Still, if Grindstormer is Days of Future Past, Batsugun is in the Court of the Crimson Kin. The absolute full-on breakthrough and the introduction for most, and it is the game that Cave would build on when they got started. As it happens, there are 2 versions of it, the original and a special version that's also available in MAME. This one never actually got a release to the public, but it was shown at the AOU show in Tokyo around the beginning of 1994, and along with some changes to the graphics, it does feature quite a few gameplay changes such as an even smaller hitbox, bigger bombs, tougher gameplay loops and so on. It didn't take too long for the game's ROM to be preserved, and it is pretty much the only unreleased Toaplan title we can actually play. And the special version is really the one to play, although you are going to have an amazing time whichever one you choose. An all-time legendary shoot 'em up, and an absolutely stunning way for Toaplan to close up. Now, while Batsugun is the last game released under the Toaplan name, it isn't quite the finish. There was one game released under the company's new name, which was Hanafram, and that was Snow Brothers 2, which came out in April of 1994. Hell, this title literally came out just in time, with the company finally announcing bankruptcy on March 31st, and as such it didn't exactly get produced in high numbers. Anyway, this sequel to the excellent 1990 game is largely more of the same, only this time you have 4 playable characters to choose from, all of which have a different weapon at their disposal. They all still freeze enemies and cover them in snow, but the effect that's produced when that snowball gets rolled or chucked is wildly different. If you liked the original Snow Brothers, then you're certainly going to enjoy this one. It is definitely refreshed thanks to having the variation in weapons, even if those portraits of the characters on the select screen are, well, quite hideously ugly, it must be said. Fine work indeed. The end of Toaplan was, weirdly, kind of similar to the end of Orca, going by what Tatsuya Uemura said about it in 2009 for Guy. The staff kinda knew, without it being said, that the writing was on the wall for a good couple of months before the closure. At some stage, the company's CEO basically went AWOL from the office, apparently having gone on an ultimately fruitless search for investment in Shibuya. In the end, it seems that, like several other companies, including Data East and Technos, the bursting of Japan's economic bubble was what did it for them. They actually expanded a lot in their last couple of years, with new hires and new officers, but all of a sudden the money just wasn't there anymore, and the company couldn't continue. People still worked on their respective projects until the hammer fell, and there were a few games in the works that never made it. There was the aforementioned sequel to Teki P, an 8-player simultaneous racing game called Dynamic Trial 7 that did get shown off at trade shows, a side-scrolling hack-and-slash called Dystopia that was a little similar to Demon's World, and a couple of others that aren't known about. The ROM for Dynamic Trial 7 is out there, but unfortunately it doesn't work in MAME at present. Even in a specially made configuration, the controls just don't work. As for Dystopia, there is footage of the game, and the board is around somewhere. However, it hasn't been released to MAME and is presumably undumped. It's thought that a member of Toaplan staff has it. The finish of Toaplan saw the start of many other companies. We've already mentioned Cave, and some other members of staff went to the not long-formed Raizing, but the other brand new companies were Gazelle, Tamsoft, and Takumi. Of these companies, Cave, Raizing, now known as 18, and Tamsoft are still around today, and they've all certainly made pretty big contributions to shoot 'em ups and beyond. Cave, of course, would become the new leaders in the genre, the guys right at the forefront of the brand new bullet hell, danmaku, curtain shooter, whatever on earth you want to call it genre. The other two companies are no longer around today, but Gazelle made a fine Sailor Moon based beat 'em up and Airgalette, while the Takumi Corporation are probably most famous for Gyrodine and Mars Matrix. However, their first title does provide something of an epilogue, as it is a direct sequel to a Toaplan game. The Takumi team were working on Twin Cobra 2 at the time of Toaplan's closure, and eventually Taito allowed the team to finish it as their first game. And so Twin Cobra 2 came out in November 1995, published by Taito. The power-up systems and the like are pretty faithful to the original, and to be honest, most things are generally faithful to the original. It is a defiantly old-school flavoured shooter for the most part, even if the hitbox is a little bit smaller than it would have been in the original's heyday. As such, Twin Cobra 2 is a game that does feel rather out of time when compared to contemporary entries in the genre like Cave's Donpachi, Gazelle's Airgalette, and Raizing's Battle Gariga. But then perhaps it's best not to think of Twin Cobra 2 as being in direct competition with those games. It's more something that provides a bit of closure, finishing the whole Toaplan story with a sequel to what was their most successful game. And as far as these older styles go, yeah, it's pretty good. As good as the original, or Fireshark, or Truxton? No, but it's a decent tribute, and at this stage of the game, well, that's what matters. Takumi would go on to better and more relevant titles, but they got their start by finishing a story. And with that, we finished covering the almighty Toaplan. Hopefully you've enjoyed this journey through one of the all-time greats in the shoot-'em-up genre. After all, while there's certainly been some decent or at least interesting efforts in other areas scattered throughout this video, it's not too hard to tell just where the company's expertise lay. They changed the entire game in the genre, and their work would continue to influence the genre for years after their departure, especially through the games that were made by the companies that were born out of them. The impact Toaplan had on one of the arcade's signature genres was, frankly, incalculable, and they deserve all the roses they can possibly get. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.